The frozen air seared Molly Harrison's lungs as she stumbled through the darkness, her bare feet leaving crimson prints in the snow that should not have been falling in Texas, but winter had turned cruel and unforgiving in the year 1883. Behind her, somewhere in the sprawling ranch house she had fled, Marcus Whitfield would soon discover her absence, and when he did, his rage would be terrible. She had been his mail-order bride for 3 months. 3 months of learning that the charming letters he had written were nothing but lies, that his true nature was as cold and brutal as the unexpected blizzard that had swept down from the northern plains into Taylor, Texas. Her feet screamed with pain, but she pushed forward through the drifts that came up past her ankles, her thin nightdress offering no protection against the howling wind. She had not planned this escape, had not prepared, but when Marcus had passed out drunk after striking her across the face for serving his supper too cold, she knew it was now or never. The bruise on her cheek throbbed in time with her heartbeat as she made her way towards the tree line, toward anywhere that was not that house of horrors. The snow fell harder now, thick flakes that obscured her vision and made every step treacherous. She could barely see 5 feet ahead, but she forced herself onward, clutching her arms around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. Her teeth chattered so violently she feared they might crack, and her fingers had gone numb minutes ago. Still, she would rather freeze to death out here in the wilderness than spend another night under Marcus Whitfield's roof. She had come to Texas full of hope, a 19-year-old woman from Pennsylvania who had lost both parents to illness and found herself alone in the world with few prospects. Marcus's letters had painted a picture of a prosperous rancher seeking a gentle wife to share his life, someone to bring warmth and companionship to his comfortable home. The reality had been a nightmare. The ranch was indeed prosperous, but Marcus ruled it with an iron fist, and he had expected her to be as subservient as his cattle, as silent as his horses. Molly did not know how long she walked. Time lost meaning in the whiteout conditions, and her mind began to play tricks on her. She thought she heard Marcus shouting her name, but when she spun around, there was nothing but snow and darkness. She thought she saw lights in the distance, but they disappeared when she blinked. Her feet were beyond pain now, settled into a numb heaviness that made each step feel like she was dragging anvils. She stumbled, fell forward into a drift, and for a moment considered simply staying there. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the cold take her, to drift away into peaceful oblivion. But something deep inside her refused to surrender. She had survived the loss of her parents, survived the long journey west, survived 3 months of Marcus's cruelty. She would survive this too. With tremendous effort, she pushed herself back to her feet and continued onward. The landscape had become completely unfamiliar. She had no idea if she was still on Marcus's land or if she had crossed onto neighboring property. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, had to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man who had made her life a living hell. Then, through the swirling snow, she saw it. A flickering light that did not disappear when she blinked. A cabin small and sturdy with smoke rising from its chimney. Hope surged through her exhausted body, giving her the strength to push forward. She half walked, half crawled toward the structure, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. She reached the door and raised her numb fist to knock, but her strength finally gave out. She collapsed against the rough wooden planks, her body crumpling like a rag doll. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was the sound of the door opening and a man's startled voice calling out in concern. Warmth was the first thing Molly became aware of as consciousness slowly returned. Blessed, wonderful warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. The second thing was pain, a fierce burning sensation in her feet that made her gasp. Her eyes flew open and she found herself lying on a narrow bed covered with thick wool blankets. The room was small but tidy, lit by the glow of a fire crackling in a stone hearth. "Easy now," a deep voice said, and she turned her head to see a man kneeling beside the bed. his hands hovering over her feet, which were wrapped in clean white cloth. "You are safe here. I am not going to hurt you." Molly's breath caught in her throat as she took in the man before her. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that fell nearly to his shoulders. His eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue like storm clouds over the ocean, and they regarded her with genuine concern. He wore simple clothes, a worn flannel shirt, and denim pants, and his hands were large and calloused from hard work. "Who are you?" Molly managed to whisper, her throat raw from the cold. "Franklin Thorne," he replied, his voice gentle. "I have a small spread about 5 miles west of Taylor. Found you collapsed on my doorstep about an hour ago. You were near frozen solid, madam. What in God's name were you doing out in this blizzard in just a nightdress?" The mention of her state of undress made Molly suddenly aware that she was still wearing only the thin cotton nightgown. She pulled the blankets higher, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Franklin seemed to sense her discomfort and turned his gaze away, focusing instead on adjusting the bandages on her feet. "I had to escape," Molly said quietly. "I had no choice." Franklin's hands stilled, and when he looked back at her, his expression had hardened. "Escape from who? Did someone do this to you?" His eyes traveled to the bruise on her cheek, and his jaw clenched. "Who hit you?" "My husband, Moss," Molly admitted, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Marcus Whitfield, do you know him?" Franklin's expression darkened further. "I know of him. He has the big ranch east of here, runs a crew of about 20 men. He came into town a few months back boasting about his new bride from back east." He paused, studying her face. "You are her, I take it?" Molly nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "I answered his advertisement for a wife. His letters made him seem kind, respectable. But when I arrived, everything changed. He was cruel, controlling. Tonight he struck me for the 3rd time this week, and I knew I could not stay any longer. I waited until he drank himself unconscious, and then I ran. I did not think about shoes or a coat. I just ran." Franklin's expression softened with sympathy, and he reached out as if to touch her hand but stopped himself. "You are incredibly brave, Mrs. What should I call you?" "Molly," she said. "Please just call me Molly. I do not want his name attached to mine any longer than necessary." "Molly, then," Franklin said, and the way he spoke her name, with such gentle respect, made her want to weep. "Your feet took quite a beating out there in the snow. I have wrapped them as best I can, but you will need to stay off them for several days at least. Some of your toes show signs of frostbite. I have done what I can, but they are going to pain you something fierce as they heal." "I do not care," Molly said firmly. "Any pain is worth it if it means I'm free of him." Franklin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He will come looking for you. You know, a man like Marcus Whitfield will not take kindly to his wife running off. He will see it as a challenge to his pride." Fear coursed through Molly's body. She had known this, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud made it terrifyingly real. "What should I do? Where can I go?" "You are not going anywhere with your feet in that condition," Franklin said firmly. "You will stay here where it is warm and safe. When the storm passes and you are healed enough to travel, we will figure out your next steps. But for now, you rest and recover." "I cannot ask you to take such a risk," Molly protested. "If Marcus finds me here, he will be furious. He might hurt you." A ghost of a smile crossed Franklin's face, though there was no humor in it. "I would like to see him try. I am not one of his cowed ranch hands, and this is my property. You are under my protection now, Molly. I give you my word that I will not let him take you back against your will." The conviction in his voice, the steady determination in his eyes, made Molly believe him. For the first time since she had arrived in Texas, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have no idea what this means to me." Franklin's expression gentled. "You're welcome. Now I imagine you must be hungry. Let me fix you some supper, and then you need to rest. Your body has been through quite an ordeal." He rose to his feet and moved to the stove in the corner of the cabin, where a pot of something that smelled heavenly was simmering. As he ladled stew into a bowl, Molly took the opportunity to study her surroundings more carefully. The cabin was a single room with sturdy log walls and a well-maintained roof. Besides the bed she was lying on, there was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a large trunk in one corner, and shelves lined with supplies and a few books. It was simple and sparse, but everything was clean and orderly. This was the home of a man who took pride in his space, even if he did not have much. Franklin returned with a bowl of stew and a spoon, pulling one of the chairs close to the bed so he could help her eat. "Can you sit up?" he asked. Molly tried and managed to prop herself up against the wall, though the movement made her feet throb with renewed pain. She took the bowl gratefully, and the first spoonful of the rich beef stew was like heaven on her tongue. She had not realized how hungry she was until that moment, and she ate quickly, barely pausing for breath. "Slow down," Franklin said gently. "It is not going anywhere, and you will make yourself sick." Molly forced herself to eat more slowly, savoring each bite. "This is delicious," she said between spoonfuls. "Did you make it yourself?" "I did," Franklin confirmed. "When you live alone out here, you learn to cook or you starve. I am no fancy chef, but I can make a decent stew and biscuits that will not break your teeth." "How long have you lived here?" Molly asked, curious about this man who had saved her life. "About 4 years now," Franklin said, leaning back in his chair. "I came to Texas from Missouri after my father passed. He left me a small inheritance, enough to buy this land and build the cabin. I run cattle, though not on the scale of operations like Marcus Whitfield's. I have about 100 head, which is enough for one man to manage alone. I sell them in Taylor twice a year, which gives me enough to get by." "Do you not get lonely out here by yourself?" Molly asked. Franklin was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I prefer solitude to bad company. I spent enough years working for other men, following their orders, dealing with their moods. Out here I answer to no one but myself. It suits me." Molly nodded, understanding that desire for independence more than he could know. She finished the stew and handed the bowl back to Franklin, who set it aside. Her eyelids were growing heavy, the warmth and food and exhaustion all combining to pull her toward sleep. "You should rest now," Franklin said, rising from his chair. "I will bed down by the fire. If you need anything during the night, just call out." "Where will you sleep?" Molly asked, suddenly worried. "I cannot take your bed." "The floor by the fire will do me just fine," Franklin assured her. "I have slept in far worse places, believe me. You need the bed more than I do." Before Molly could protest further, Franklin had already laid out a bedroll near the hearth and was settling himself onto it. He looked comfortable enough, and Molly was too tired to argue. She slid back down under the blankets, relishing their warmth, and let her eyes drift closed. "Franklin?" she murmured, already half asleep. "Yes?" "Thank you. For everything." "Sleep well, Molly." The storm raged outside for 2 more days, the wind howling like a living thing and the snow piling up against the cabin walls. During that time, Molly remained in bed, allowing her feet to begin the slow process of healing. Franklin tended to her with a gentle care that constantly surprised her. He changed her bandages twice a day, brought her meals, and even hauled in extra firewood to keep the cabin warm despite the brutal cold outside. They talked during those long hours trapped inside by the weather. Franklin told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about his father who had been a hard but fair man, about coming to Texas with dreams of making something of himself. Molly, in turn, shared her own story. She spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her parents who had run a small general store, of their deaths from influenza that had swept through their town 2 years prior. She told him about the loneliness that had followed, about how she had answered Marcus's advertisement out of desperation and hope. "I thought I was being practical," Molly said on the second evening, watching the firelight dance across the ceiling. "I thought that even if there was no great love, at least I would have security, a home, a purpose. I never imagined he would be so cruel." Franklin was sitting in his chair near the bed, mending a shirt. His hands stilled at her words, and he looked up at her with those storm cloud eyes. "You deserve better than that," he said simply. "Any woman does, but especially someone like you." "Someone like me?" Molly echoed, curious what he meant. Franklin seemed to realize what he had said and looked back down at his mending, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "Someone kind," he clarified. "Someone brave enough to walk barefoot through a blizzard rather than accept a life of cruelty. That takes a special kind of strength." Molly felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She had been called many things in her life, but never brave. The way Franklin saw her, the respect in his voice when he spoke to her, was so different from Marcus's contempt that it made her heart ache. On the third day, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, the snow stopped falling, and weak winter sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window. Franklin bundled up and went outside to check on his livestock, leaving Molly alone for the first time since she had arrived. She tested her feet gingerly, placing them on the floor and trying to stand. Pain shot through them immediately, but it was bearable, no longer the searing agony of the first night. She managed to take a few halting steps, holding onto the furniture for support. Her muscles were stiff from days in bed, and her feet protested every movement. But she was determined to regain her mobility. She could not hide in Franklin's cabin forever, no matter how much the thought of leaving its safety frightened her. When Franklin returned an hour later, stamping snow off his boots, he found her sitting at the table rather than lying in bed. His eyebrows rose in surprise. "Should you be up?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I need to start moving," Molly said. "I cannot stay in bed forever. Besides, I wanted to help with something. You have done so much for me, and I have done nothing but lie there like an invalid." "You have been recovering from exposure and frostbite," Franklin pointed out. "That is not being an invalid. That is being smart enough to let your body heal." "Well, I feel much better now," Molly insisted. "Please, let me help with something. I can cook, clean, mend, anything." Franklin studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But if your feet start paining you too much, you rest immediately. Agreed?" "Agreed," Molly said, relief flooding through her. She needed to feel useful, needed to contribute somehow to offset the debt she felt she owed this man. They fell into an easy routine over the following days. Molly took over the cooking, which Franklin admitted was a welcome change from his own plain fare. She made soups and stews, biscuits and cornbread, utilizing the supplies in his pantry to create meals that filled the cabin with delicious aromas. She mended his clothes, which had been neglected for some time, and tidied the cabin, organizing it in small ways that made the space more efficient. Franklin, for his part, continued his daily work around the ranch. He tended to his cattle, repaired fences that had been damaged by the storm, and chopped firewood to replenish what they had burned during the blizzard. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, or Franklin would read aloud from one of his few books while Molly worked on some bit of sewing. It was during one of these quiet evenings, about a week after Molly's arrival, that Franklin broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "The roads will be clear enough for travel in a day or two, he said, his voice careful and neutral. "We should discuss what you want to do." Molly's hands stilled on the shirt she was hemming. She had known this conversation was coming, but she still was not prepared for it. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no family, and I am still legally married to Marcus, which complicates everything." "You could seek a divorce," Franklin suggested. "Though I will not lie to you, it is not an easy process, especially for a woman. You would need grounds, and you would need money for a lawyer." "I have neither," Molly said quietly. "My only grounds would be his cruelty, and who would believe me over a prosperous rancher? He is well respected in Taylor, or so he told me. And as for money, I have nothing. Everything I owned went into the train ticket to get here, and the few possessions I brought, which are still at his ranch." Franklin was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "There is another option. You could stay here." Molly's heart skipped a beat. "Stay stay here? But I could not impose on you any longer. You have already done so much." "It would not be an imposition," Franklin said, finally looking at her. "The truth is, Molly, I have enjoyed having you here. This cabin feels more like a home with you in it than it has in all the years I have lived here alone. You are good company, you work hard," and he trailed off, seeming to struggle with his words. "And I would feel better knowing you were safe rather than wondering if you ended up in some worse situation." "But what would people say?" Molly asked, her practical side asserting itself despite the hope blooming in her chest. "An unmarried man and a married woman living together would cause quite a scandal." "We are 5 miles from town," Franklin pointed out. "As long as we are discreet, who is to know? And even if word did get out, I find I care more about your safety than I do about gossip." Molly wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to accept his offer and never leave the sanctuary of this cabin. But she forced herself to think it through. "What about Marcus? He will not simply forget about me. He might come looking." "Let him come," Franklin said, and there was steel in his voice. "This is my land, and he has no legal right to enter it without my permission. If he shows up here, I will send him away, and if he tries to take you by force, I will defend you. I am a fair shot with a rifle, and I am not afraid of Marcus Whitfield." The fierce protectiveness in Franklin's voice made Molly's breath catch. No one had ever stood up for her like this, had ever made her feel so valued and protected. She looked at this man who had taken her in without question, who had cared for her when she was at her most vulnerable, and she felt something shift in her chest, something warm and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You do not know me, do not owe me anything. Why risk so much for a stranger?" Franklin met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the answer before he spoke it. "Because you are not a stranger anymore, Molly, and because when I look at you, I see someone worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, charged with unspoken emotion. Molly felt tears prick at her eyes, but for the first time in months, they were not tears of fear or pain, but of gratitude and something deeper, something she did not dare name yet. "Yes," she whispered, "I will stay, if you are sure you want me here." "I am sure," Franklin said, and the smile that crossed his face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. The weeks that followed were the happiest Molly could remember in years. Winter maintained its grip on the land, but inside the cabin there was warmth and comfort and an easy companionship that grew deeper with each passing day. Her feet healed slowly but steadily, the frostbite damage proving less severe than Franklin had initially feared. By the end of the 3rd week, she could walk without pain, though she still moved carefully. Franklin taught her about ranching life, showing her how to care for the horses in his small stable and explaining the rhythms of cattle management. Molly, in turn, brought small touches of domesticity to the cabin that transformed it. She made curtains from some spare fabric Franklin had, hemming them carefully to fit the window. She organized his sparse library, creating a small reading corner. She even planted some herb seeds in small pots on the windowsill, anticipating the spring to come. They were careful to maintain propriety. Franklin continued to sleep on his bedroll by the fire while Molly kept the bed. They were never physically intimate beyond the occasional accidental brush of hands when passing something at the table. But the emotional intimacy that grew between them was undeniable. They talked about everything, from their childhoods to their dreams for the future, from their fears to their hopes. Franklin proved to be an intelligent, thoughtful man with a dry sense of humor that often caught Molly by surprise and made her laugh. He was well-read despite his limited library, and he had a way of looking at the world that was both practical and philosophical. He was also incredibly kind, not just to Molly, but to his animals, to the land, to everyone he encountered on his occasional trips into town. Molly found herself watching him when he did not notice, admiring the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way his hands were gentle despite their calluses, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She noticed little things like how he always made sure her coffee was ready in the morning before she woke, how he saved the best portions of meat for her at dinner, how he would drape an extra blanket over her in the evening if he thought she looked cold. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one morning as she watched him through the window, chopping firewood in the pale winter sunlight. The thought should have frightened her, should have made her want to pull back and protect her heart. Instead, it filled her with a quiet joy. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not the desperate hope she had felt when reading Marcus's letters, but this steady, growing warmth that made her feel safe and cherished and alive. But she did not speak of these feelings. How could she when she was still legally married to another man? It would not be fair to Franklin to burden him with her heart when she could offer him nothing in return, no future, no legitimacy. So she kept her love hidden, letting it grow in the secret spaces of her heart while outwardly maintaining the friendly distance of a houseguest. If Franklin felt the same, he gave no clear indication beyond his continued kindness and protection. But sometimes Molly would catch him looking at her with an expression in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, something tender and longing that disappeared as soon as he noticed her noticing. In those moments, she wondered if perhaps she was not alone in her feelings. A month after Molly's arrival, Franklin made his regular trip into Taylor to purchase supplies. He invited Molly to come along, but she declined, not yet ready to risk being seen in town where Marcus might hear of it. Franklin understood and went alone, promising to be back before nightfall. He returned in the late afternoon, his expression troubled. Molly knew immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked as he came through the door, stamping snow from his boots. Franklin set down the sacks of supplies he carried and turned to face her. "Marcus Whitfield was in town," he said. "I saw him at the general store. He looked like hell, to be honest. Unshaven, disheveled, like he has not been sleeping well." Molly's heart began to race. "Did he see you? Did he say anything?" "He saw me, but I do not think he knows who I am or that I have any connection to you," Franklin said. "But I heard him talking to the sheriff. He is still looking for you, Molly. He has told everyone you disappeared during the storm, that he thinks you got lost and likely perished in the cold. He is playing the grieving husband." Anger flashed through Molly. "Of course he is. I am sure he is enjoying the sympathy." "The thing is," Franklin continued, his expression growing more serious, "I heard the sheriff tell him that if your body is not found by spring, he can have you declared legally dead. Then he would be free to remarry, to put this whole incident behind him." Molly absorbed this information, her emotions a complicated tangle. On one hand, the idea of Marcus moving on with his life, perhaps tormenting some other poor woman, filled her with rage. On the other hand, if she was declared dead, she would be free in a way. Marcus would not come looking for a corpse. "What are you thinking?" Franklin asked, watching her carefully. "I am thinking that perhaps being dead is not the worst thing that could happen to me," Molly said slowly. "If everyone believes I perished in the storm, then I can start over. I can build a new life without constantly looking over my shoulder." "You would be giving up your name, your identity," Franklin pointed out. "You would have to be someone else entirely." "Molly Harrison died in a snowstorm," Molly said, testing the words. "But maybe someone new could be born. Someone who is not running away but running toward something better." Franklin was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "If that is what you want, I will help you however I can. You can stay here as long as you like, and when you are ready, I can help you establish a new identity, maybe help you get to another town where you can start fresh." His words, though well-intentioned, struck Molly like a blow. Of course he was thinking about her leaving, about her starting a new life somewhere else. Why would he want her to stay here permanently, complicating his simple, solitary existence? She forced a smile, ignoring the ache in her chest. "Thank you, Franklin. You have been so good to me." As winter slowly released its grip and early signs of spring began to appear, the atmosphere in the cabin grew strangely tense. Molly could not shake the feeling that something was building between her and Franklin, something unspoken but powerful. They moved around each other carefully now, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every shared glance. One evening in early March, as they sat by the fire after supper, Franklin suddenly spoke. "Molly, I need to tell you something." Her heart leaped into her throat. "What is it?" Franklin turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw nervousness, hope, and determination all mixed together. "These past 2 months with you here have been the best of my life. This cabin was just a structure before, but you have made it a home. Your presence has brought light and warmth and joy into my days. I wake up looking forward to seeing your smile at breakfast. I go about my work thinking about what I will tell you that evening. You have become essential to me in a way I never expected, and He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I have fallen in love with you, Molly, completely and irrevocably. I know you are still technically married. I know it is improper and probably foolish, but I cannot keep it to myself any longer. I love you, and if you were free, I would ask you to be my wife in truth, not out of desperation or necessity, but because I want to spend every day for the rest of my life with you." Molly felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. "Franklin," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I love you too. I have been in love with you for weeks now, but I did not dare say anything. I thought you saw me only as a charity case, someone you were helping out of the goodness of your heart." Franklin moved from his chair to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his. "You are so much more than that," he said fiercely. "You are brave and strong and kind. You are brilliant and funny and beautiful. You make me want to be a better man. And I swear to you, if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." "I am not free," Molly said, even as her heart soared. "I am still married to Marcus, at least in the eyes of the law." "Then we will find a way to change that," Franklin said. "We will go to a different county, find a lawyer who will take on your case. We will fight for your freedom. And in the meantime, we will live our lives as we see fit. I do not care what anyone else thinks. All I care about is you." Molly looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but sincerity and love, and she made her decision. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. It was her first kiss that meant something. Her first kiss given freely out of love rather than obligation. Franklin responded immediately, his arms coming around her to pull her close, and for a long moment nothing existed but the two of them and the love that blazed between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "I will marry you properly one day," he promised. "When you are free, I will marry you in a church with witnesses and make you Mrs. Franklin Thorne in the eyes of God and the law." "I would like that," Molly whispered, "but even without the ceremony, my heart already belongs to you." They sat together by the fire for hours that night, talking about their future, making plans. They decided that Molly would take a new name for everyday use. She would be Margaret Hawthorne if anyone asked, a widow who had come west after her husband's death. Franklin would introduce her as his housekeeper to any neighbors or visitors, maintaining the pretense of propriety while they worked toward a more permanent solution. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the harsh landscape into something gentler. The snow melted, revealing the brown grass beneath, which slowly turned green as warmer weather established itself. Wildflowers began to dot the meadows, and the cattle grew sleek and fat on the fresh grazing. Franklin took Molly riding across his land, showing her every corner of his small ranch. He pointed out where he planned to expand his herd, where he thought about building a proper barn, where the creek ran sweetest and clearest. Molly soaked it all in, seeing not just what was, but what could be. Together they could build something real here, something lasting. In April, Franklin made a trip to a town 2 counties over, seeking legal advice about Molly's situation. He returned with mixed news. A lawyer there had agreed to help, but had warned that divorcing Marcus, even with evidence of cruelty, would be difficult and expensive. It could take years and might not succeed. However, there was another option. If Molly waited until she was officially declared dead, which would likely happen by summer's end. She would be free in every practical sense. She could never return to her old identity, but she could marry again under her new name without legal complications. It was not a perfect solution, but it was the best they had. Molly agreed to it without hesitation. She had no desire to return to being Mrs. Marcus Whitfield. That woman, frightened and desperate, no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth, someone who had found real love. As spring turned to summer, Molly and Franklin's relationship deepened. They were lovers now in every sense, their physical intimacy a natural extension of the emotional bond they shared. Franklin was a gentle, considerate lover, always making sure of Molly's comfort and pleasure. Being with him was nothing like the brutal, selfish encounters she had endured with Marcus. This was an expression of love, a joining of two souls who had found each other against all odds. They were careful, knowing that a child would complicate their already complicated situation, but they also knew that someday, when everything was settled, they would welcome children. They talked about it sometimes, lying tangled together in the bed they now shared, imagining a future with sons and daughters running through the cabin, filling it with laughter and life. In late June, Franklin returned from a supply run with significant news. Marcus Whitfield had indeed petitioned to have his wife declared legally dead, and the court had granted it. As far as the law and the public were concerned, Molly Harrison had perished in the blizzard of January 1883. Marcus was a free man, already reportedly courting another woman from a neighboring town. "How do you feel, Sprig?" Franklin asked Molly when he told her the news. Molly considered the question carefully. "Free," she finally said. "Lighter somehow. I know it is strange, being declared dead when I'm very much alive. But that person, the frightened girl who came to Texas as a mail-order bride, she really did die in that snow. I am someone new now." "Margaret Hawthorne," Franklin said, testing the name. "No," Molly said with a smile. "I think I am ready to be Molly Thorne, if you will still have me." Franklin's face lit up with joy. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying marry me, Franklin Thorne. Make me your wife in truth. We do not need a fancy ceremony or a crowd of witnesses. All we need is each other and our promises before God." Franklin swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was breathless with laughter. "Yes," he said when he finally set her down. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, but I want to do this right. I want you to have a real wedding, even if it is a small one. You deserve that." They were married a week later in a tiny church in a town 3 counties away where no one knew them. The minister was an elderly man who asked few questions and seemed genuinely moved by the obvious love between the couple before him. They had no guests, but they did not need any. They spoke their vows with absolute sincerity, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever trials life might bring. Franklin slipped a simple gold band onto Molly's finger, and she did the same for him with a ring she had purchased with money she had earned selling eggs and butter to a neighbor who asked no uncomfortable questions. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was sweet and joyous, a celebration of everything they had overcome to reach this moment. They spent their wedding night in a small hotel, a rare extravagance, before returning to the ranch the next day. As they approached the cabin, Franklin suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. "Wait here," he told Molly, then dismounted and went inside. Confused, Molly sat on her horse and waited. A few moments later, Franklin emerged and walked over to her. Before she could ask what he was doing, he reached up and lifted her down from the saddle. Then, to her surprise and delight, he swept her up into his arms and carried her toward the cabin door. "Franklin, what are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said with a grin. "I told you I wanted to do this right." He carried her inside and set her gently on her feet, and Molly looked around the cabin that had become her home with tears of happiness in her eyes. This was where her new life had begun, where she had found safety and healing and love. This was where she would build her future with the man she loved. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. Molly threw herself into improving the ranch, using her sharp mind and organizational skills to streamline Franklin's operations. She took over the financial records, keeping meticulous accounts that helped them understand exactly where they stood and where they could afford to expand. She also started a kitchen garden, growing vegetables that supplemented their diet and provided extra income when she sold the surplus in town. Franklin, for his part, worked harder than ever, driven by the desire to build a prosperous future for his wife. He expanded his herd gradually, making careful purchases of quality cattle that would improve his stock. He repaired and upgraded every structure on the property, taking pride in maintaining his land. He was a good rancher, patient, and knowledgeable, and his operation began to attract notice for its efficiency and quality. They were happy, genuinely and deeply happy, in a way that sometimes made Molly pause and marvel at her good fortune. She had gone from the depths of despair, walking barefoot through snow to escape a nightmare, to this life of love and partnership with a man who valued and respected her. Sometimes she still woke in the night, heart pounding from dreams of Marcus, but Franklin was always there to hold her and remind her she was safe. In October, nearly a year after Molly had stumbled onto Franklin's doorstep, she realized her monthly courses were late. At first, she dismissed it as stress or a natural irregularity, but when another week passed and then another, she began to suspect the truth. She waited to be certain before saying anything to Franklin, but when a full month had passed with no sign of her menses and her breasts began to feel tender, she knew. She chose a quiet evening to tell him after they had finished supper and were sitting together on the porch Franklin had built that summer. The air was turning crisp with the approaching winter, but it was pleasant with a blanket wrapped around them. "Franklin," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "I am with child," Molly said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "I am almost certain all the signs are there." For a moment, Franklin just stared at her, and Molly felt a flutter of anxiety. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses in the nearby corral. He grabbed her and spun her around, then immediately set her down with a worried expression. "Is that all right? Should I not be spinning you? I do not want to hurt the baby." Molly laughed, her anxiety melting away. "I am pregnant, not made of glass, but yes, maybe we should save the spinning for after the baby arrives." "A baby," Franklin said, wonder in his voice. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Molly, you have made me the happiest man alive." "So you are pleased?" Molly asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Pleased does not begin to cover it," Franklin said. "I am overjoyed, ecstatic, terrified, all of it at once. We are going to be parents, Molly." They held each other on the porch as the sun set, talking about the future that was suddenly so immediate and real. They discussed names, how they would need to expand the cabin to make room for a nursery, what they would need to purchase before the baby arrived. Franklin was already planning, thinking through every detail with the same careful consideration he applied to everything. The months that followed were filled with preparation. Franklin built an addition onto the cabin, creating a second bedroom that would serve as the nursery. Molly sewed baby clothes and blankets, her hands moving with practiced skill. She also made arrangements with a midwife in town, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, who asked no prying questions about Molly's past and seemed genuinely excited about the upcoming birth. Molly's pregnancy progressed well. She felt healthy and strong, though tired in the early months and uncomfortable in the later ones as her belly swelled. Franklin was endlessly solicitous, constantly worried that she was overworking herself. Molly found his concern endearing, though she also had to firmly remind him that she was perfectly capable of continuing her regular activities. As her due date approached in early June, they both grew nervous. Franklin became even more protective, barely wanting to leave Molly's side. She understood his anxiety, having heard enough stories about the dangers of childbirth, but she also felt a strange calm. She had survived so much already that she felt certain she would survive this too. Her labor began on a warm morning in mid-June, with gentle contractions that gradually increased in intensity. Franklin immediately sent for Mrs. Patterson, who arrived within a few hours and took over with calm efficiency. Franklin paced outside the cabin, too anxious to sit still, but banned from the birthing room by the midwife who insisted he would just be in the way. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Molly had known it would be painful, but the reality exceeded her expectations, but she bore it with gritted determination, refusing to give in to fear. Mrs. Patterson was wonderful, offering encouragement and practical assistance, guiding Molly through each contraction and each stage of labor. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Molly gave a final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. Mrs. Patterson worked quickly, clearing the infant's airways and wrapping the squirming little body in a clean blanket before placing the bundle in Molly's arms. "You have a son," Mrs. Patterson announced with a tired but happy smile. "A strong, healthy boy." Molly looked down at the tiny face of her son, and her heart felt like it might burst from the swell of love that overtook her. He had a dusting of dark hair, and his eyes, though they would likely change color, were currently a deep blue-gray. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, and tears of joy streamed down her face as she held him close. "Can I come in?" Franklin's voice called anxiously from outside the door. "Come meet your son," Molly called back, her voice weak but happy. Franklin burst through the door and crossed to the bed in 3 long strides. When he saw the baby in Molly's arms, he froze, his expression one of absolute awe. "May I?" he asked hesitantly, holding out his arms. Molly carefully transferred the baby to his father, and watching Franklin hold their son for the first time, she fell in love with her husband all over again. His large, calloused hands were so gentle, cradling the tiny body, and the expression on his face was one of pure wonder and love. "Hello, little one," Franklin murmured. "I am your father, and I promise you I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life, to keep you safe, to teach you right from wrong. You are so loved already, more than you could ever know." "What should we name him?" Molly asked. They had discussed names for months, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Franklin said, "What about James, after my father? James Michael Thorne." "James," Molly tested the name. "I like it. James Michael Thorne. Welcome to the world, little James." Mrs. Patterson stayed for a few more hours, making sure both mother and baby were stable and comfortable. She gave them instructions on caring for the infant, though much of it was common sense. Before she left, she looked at Molly with kind eyes. "You have a beautiful family, Mrs. Thorne. That little boy is lucky to have parents who love him and each other so much." After the midwife departed, Franklin sat on the edge of the bed, unable to take his eyes off his wife and child. "Thank you," he said softly. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving us this. I know the past year has not been easy, but Molly, you have given me everything I never knew I needed." Molly reached out and took his hand. "We gave this to each other," she said. "None of this would have been possible without you. You saved my life, Franklin. In every way that matters, you saved my life." The months after James's birth were challenging in new ways. Neither Molly nor Franklin had much experience with infants, and they learned through trial and error how to meet their son's needs. James was a good baby for the most part, healthy and generally content, but he had his fussy moments and sleepless nights like any infant. They were both exhausted much of the time, but they were also happier than ever. Watching James grow and develop, seeing his first smiles and hearing his first laughs, was endlessly fascinating. Franklin proved to be a devoted father, helping with feedings and diaper changes without complaint, walking the floor with James when the baby would not settle. As James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Franklin had established a reputation for quality cattle, and buyers came from across the region to purchase his stock. Molly continued to manage the financial side of the operation, and her careful record-keeping and smart decisions helped them save money and expand gradually but steadily. When James was 2 years old, Molly discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. She gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1886, a beautiful girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray-blue eyes. They named her Sarah Elizabeth Thorne. With 2 children now, the cabin felt truly full of life. James was a curious, energetic toddler who followed his father everywhere when Franklin would allow it. Sarah was a cheerful baby who seemed to smile at everything and everyone. Franklin built another addition onto the cabin, creating more space for their growing family. One evening, when James was 4 and Sarah was 2, Molly and Franklin sat on their porch after the children were asleep, watching the sun set over the land they had worked so hard to build. Molly leaned against Franklin's shoulder, feeling utterly content. "Do you ever think about that night?" Franklin asked quietly. "The night you showed up on my doorstep?" "Sometimes," Molly admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to a different person. In a way, I suppose it did." "I think about it often," Franklin said. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you. If the storm had been worse, if you had gone in a different direction, if I had not heard you at the door, we would have missed this entire life together." "But we did not miss it," Molly said, turning to look at her husband. "We found each other against all odds, and every day since has been a gift." Franklin kissed her forehead. "I love you, Molly Thorne. I loved you when you were a frightened woman fleeing into a blizzard. I loved you when you were recovering in my cabin. I loved you when you agreed to stay, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Molly replied. "You gave me back my life. Franklin, you showed me what real love looks like, what a true partnership can be. You are the best man I have ever known." Years continued to pass peacefully. James grew into a responsible, hard-working boy who loved the ranch and showed every sign of following in his father's footsteps. Sarah was bright and curious, always asking questions and wanting to learn everything about everything. In 1889, Molly gave birth to another son, whom they named William after Molly's father. William was a calm, serious baby who observed the world with solemn eyes before breaking into sudden, brilliant smiles. The ranch expanded along with their family. Franklin hired a few hands to help with the increasing workload, good men who respected their employer and his family. They built a proper barn, expanded the grazing land, and increased their herd substantially. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and secure, able to provide well for their children and save for the future. Molly sometimes thought about Marcus Whitfield, wondered what had become of him. She heard through town gossip, which reached even their somewhat isolated ranch, that he had indeed remarried. His second wife had left him within a year, and his third wife was reportedly as miserable as Molly had been. His ranch still prospered, but his personal life was apparently a disaster. Molly felt sorry for the women who had fallen into his trap, but she also felt grateful beyond measure that she had escaped when she did. She never regretted her decision to run into that blizzard. Yes, it had been dangerous and desperate, and she had nearly died. But it had also led her to Franklin, to this life, to these children. Every scar on her feet from that night of frostbite was worth it 1,000 times over. As the century drew toward its close, the Thorne family had become a fixture in the community. Franklin was respected as a skilled rancher and honest businessman. Molly, known to everyone as Margaret Thorne, was admired for her intelligence and kindness. She helped neighbors when they were sick or in need, shared her abundant garden harvests, and became known as someone who could be counted on in times of trouble. Their children thrived. James, at 12, was already skilled at working cattle and had a natural way with horses. Sarah, at 10, had learned to read and write and was constantly buried in whatever books she could get her hands on. William, at 5, was following in his siblings' footsteps, curious about everything and eager to help with any task, no matter how small. On a winter evening in 1893, almost exactly 10 years after the night Molly had walked barefoot through the snow, The family gathered around the fireplace in their expanded cabin. Franklin and Molly sat together on the sofa Franklin had built, while the children sprawled on the floor playing a game with carved wooden pieces. "Tell us the story," Sarah said suddenly, looking up at her parents. "Tell us how you met." It was a story the children had heard many times, though the version they knew was carefully edited. As far as they knew, their mother had been a widow traveling west who had gotten caught in a blizzard and found shelter at their father's cabin. The truth of Marcus Whitfield, of Molly's desperate flight, of the complicated path to their marriage, was not something they needed to know. "Well," Franklin began, exchanging a glance with Molly, "it was a winter night much like this one, cold and snowy. I heard a knock at my door, and when I opened it, there was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Half frozen, but with the most determined look in her eyes." "And what did you do?" James prompted, even though he knew the answer. "I brought her inside, wrapped her feet in warm cloths because she had been walking through the snow, and held her close to share my warmth," Franklin continued. "And I knew right then that I had met someone special, someone worth fighting for." "That is so romantic," Sarah sighed, her young heart already drawn to stories of love. "It was terrifying at the time," Molly added with a laugh. "But your father took care of me and we became friends. And then, well, we fell in love." "And then you got married and had us," William said matter-of-factly. "That is right," Franklin confirmed, reaching over to ruffle his youngest son's hair. "And it was the best decision we ever made." Later that night, after the children were in bed, Molly and Franklin stood at the window, looking out at the snow that had begun to fall, gentle flakes drifting down to blanket the land. Molly's hand instinctively went to the small scars on her feet, barely visible now, but still present. Permanent reminders of the night that had changed everything. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" Franklin asked, seeming to sense where her thoughts had gone. "That you had not had to go through all that pain and fear?" Molly considered the question seriously. "No," she finally said. "I wish I'd never met Marcus Whitfield, never had to suffer through his cruelty. But that night in the snow, that walk that led me to you, no, I would not change that. It brought me here, to this life, to you and our children. And that is worth everything I went through." Franklin pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her just as he had that first night when she was frozen and frightened and desperate. But now she was warm and safe and loved, surrounded by the family they had built together. "I am so proud of you," Franklin murmured into her hair, "of your strength, your resilience, your capacity to love despite everything you endured. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Molly Thorne." "We made this life together," Molly replied, tilting her head up to kiss him. "Your kindness, your protection, your love, that is what made all of this possible. You saw me at my lowest moment and chose to help, chose to care. Not every man would have done that." "Then not every man knows what matters," Franklin said simply. They stood together at the window for a long time, watching the snow fall and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperation to hope, from fear to love, from a terrifying flight through a blizzard to this warm cabin filled with laughter and life. In the years that followed, the Thorne Ranch continued to grow and prosper. James grew into a fine young man who eventually married a kind girl from town and built his own cabin on a corner of the family land, expanding the operation. Sarah, brilliant and determined, became a teacher, educating children throughout the region. William followed his father's footsteps completely, taking over more and more of the ranch operations as Franklin aged. Franklin and Molly grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They became grandparents, delighting in James's children and eventually Sarah's when she married later in life. They watched their family tree branch and grow, knowing that all of it had stemmed from one desperate, brave act on a snowy night so many years ago. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Franklin gave Molly a gift, a new pair of boots, the finest she had ever owned. But tucked inside one boot was something else, a small velvet box. Molly opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Franklin and herself on their wedding day, and on the other side photographs of their 3 children. "So you never forget," Franklin said, "where we started and what we built." "I could never forget," Molly said, tears in her eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. "This is the life I was meant to live. You are the man I was meant to love. Everything that came before was just leading me to you." They sat together on their porch, the same porch where they had shared so many sunsets, held hands through so many conversations, built so many dreams. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and well-maintained, a testament to decades of hard work and dedication. In the distance, they could see James working with his own children, teaching them the skills his father had taught him. "We did good, did we not?" Franklin said softly. "We did better than good," Molly replied. "We did wonderful." As the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Molly thought about the terrified woman who had run barefoot through the snow, seeking freedom or death. She thought about the kind cowboy who had wrapped her feet and held her close, offering safety and warmth and eventually love. She thought about the life they had built together, the family they had raised, the love that had sustained them through every challenge. That woman in the snow had been looking for escape. What she had found was so much more: a home, a partner, a purpose, a love that would endure until the end of their days and beyond. She had walked barefoot through snow to escape him, and a cowboy had wrapped her feet and held her close. From that desperate moment had come everything that mattered, everything that made life worth living. Franklin reached over and took Molly's hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of decades together. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 2 souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful together. "I love you, Molly Thorne," Franklin said, just as he had said countless times over the years. "And I love you, Franklin Thorne," Molly replied, just as she had replied countless times before. But the words never lost their meaning, never became rote or empty. Each time they spoke them, they were affirming the choice they had made all those years ago, the choice to love and be loved, to build a life together, to face whatever challenges came their way side by side. The night grew darker and cooler, but neither of them moved to go inside. They were content where they were, together as they had always been and always would be. Around them, the ranch was quiet, settling down for the night. Inside the house, William was reading before bed, preparing to take over the ranch operations completely now that his father was beginning to slow down with age. In the cabin across the property, James was tucking his children into bed, telling them stories just as his parents had told stories to him. In town, Sarah was grading papers by lamplight, shaping young minds and making her own contribution to the community. It was a good life, a full life, a life that had started with an act of desperate courage and had blossomed into something neither Molly nor Franklin could have imagined in those early days. The fear and pain of that snowy night had long since faded, replaced by decades of joy and love and family. Eventually, as the night grew truly cold, they went inside together, banking the fire and preparing for bed. They had done this routine thousands of times, but it never felt mundane. Even now, in their later years, Franklin still made sure Molly was comfortable before settling down himself. Even now, Molly still felt a flutter in her heart when Franklin kissed her goodnight. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the house they had built together. Molly's hand found Franklin's under the covers, and they held tight to each other, just as they had that first night when he had wrapped her frozen feet and held her close to share his warmth. Some love stories begin with a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration. Theirs had begun with a desperate woman fleeing into a blizzard and a kind man who chose to help her. It had grown from that small seed of compassion into something extraordinary, something that had shaped not just their own lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren. As sleep claimed them both, their last conscious thoughts were of gratitude. Gratitude for that snowy night, for the choices they had made, for every moment that had led them to each other. They had walked through fire and ice, through fear and uncertainty, through challenges that might have broken lesser bonds, but their love had not just survived, it had thrived, becoming stronger and deeper with each passing year. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the ranch in white, and inside the cabin, Franklin and Molly Thorne slept peacefully, wrapped in each other's arms, knowing they were exactly where they belonged. Their story had begun with bare feet in the snow and hands wrapping tender wounds, and it would end someday as all stories must, but not for many years yet. For now, they had each other, their family, their land, and a love that had proven itself capable of weathering any storm. And that, they both knew, was more than enough. It was everything.